Today, we welcome Dr. Nicholas Rühlig, a research fellow at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, chairman of Working Group 2 for High Technology and Innovation, and the management committee member of the China in Europe Research Network, and member of the European think tank Network on China. Standardization plays a key role in supporting industry and global trade by opening opportunities for businesses to expand into new markets, meet regulatory requirements in familiar industries, and gain visibility as an industry leader. However, the standardization process for those standards used globally can be influenced by geopolitical forces. During today's discussion, Dr. Rühlig will present his work on the geopolitics of standards, a project which aims to enhance the knowledge and awareness around the increasing involvement of countries in international standardization. We look forward to your questions and engagement during the presentation. I'll be tracking the chat as we go along, so please post your questions there or send me a private chat as we go along. So welcome, Tim. Thank you so much. And at this point, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen. And thanks to Women in Standards for inviting me, for hosting me today. It's a great pleasure. And I'm sure that I will learn a lot from questions and comments in the session, and hopefully I can also bring a few insights to you. So let me maybe give you a very, very quick introduction sort of in what we do here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs, how we approach that issue, and then sort of get into the actual substance. So a couple of years ago, my background is really not on the technical side. I'm a China specialist, working on China's foreign affairs, its geopolitical ambitions. And a couple of years ago, we have been starting a project that we call the Geopolitics of Standards, and with a particular focus on China, where we aim to sort of understand what China is doing in this field, and try to carve out the implications for Europe. The EU also, of course, for Sweden, but Sweden is really not an actor if you detach it entirely from the rest of the EU. So our project is mainly targeted really at policymakers. We cooperate a lot with standards developing organizations or industry to get feedback, to get insights. But sort of if you wonder a bit where the recommendations come from, and I mean, of course, I try to always see the value and tweak it towards different audiences. But the real sort of issue that we came up with was here to make this issue that is on the agenda of standards developing organizations and industry for a long time also something that policymakers are aware of, not to take over the field, of course, but to sort of see what's happening in this field, and that we see what I would describe as a politicization of technical standardization from China's side, from China's growing influence internationally. That requires also, to some extent, I think, a political response here from EU policymakers and probably also from DC. So what am I going to do today? There is essentially two aspects I want to cover. I want to differentiate essentially between sort of the private and a state-driven approach to technical standardization and what that implies. If you show the next slide, you see on the one hand, I think we have very much a private-driven approach in the West. They are also very different. I mean, I don't need to explain to you the US system. I think it's very much really private-driven. It's really private STOs, it's industry developing technical standards and competing in a market for the best standard. Aiming to provide interoperability of technology and basic safety. And we have, I would also say, a privately owned process or privately driven process in Europe, even though this is more of a public-private partnership here, because Europeans at least aim to have a more structured or more hierarchical system there. But that is nonetheless sort of the idea here is public actors, be it the European Commission, be it EU member states, sort of draw up a general framework, and then it should be up to private actors really using that framework and developing technical standards within that framework. China has a very different approach to it. Within sort of when we look at the domestic standardization arena, I think it's really a matter of industrial policy making, which means I think the ownership, I would say, belongs to the party state. They are the ones driving the agenda, trying to control what is happening there, at least to some extent. That doesn't mean that technical specifications in themselves are written by industry, by state officials, because of course they don't have the capabilities. But the whole process as such, the framework, the institutions are owned, are controlled by the party state by different mechanisms that I'm going to lay out here. So the domestic, to understand China's domestic standardization as an industrial policy is the first point I want to make. And the second is sort of in the international arena, China is trying to use that essentially as a means of international power projection. And again, that is of course something that is essentially on the party state's agenda and not so much the industry. Exactly, thanks. You see those three different types of standards. Again, national standards are developed in technical committees as well, like you know it from the West. But those technical committees are under the framework of the Standards Administration of China, which is again a part of the State Administration for Market Regulation. And that already gives you a sense that SAC is not a private body. It's not ANSI in the US. It is not DIN maybe in Germany or SEN or SENELEC on the European level. Private SDOs, but in China, it's a part of a state ministry. It's SAMR is part of the State Council of China. So SAC is really a department of that. So it is part of a state ministry. What you can see is that as of March 2021, we have a bit more than 36,600 voluntary standards, national standards, and we have around a bit more than 2,100 mandatory standards. Now, I mean, the whole concept of mandatory standards may sound a bit weird to us, even though there's also mandatory standards in some Western countries. But frankly, before the reform, that has sort of been a partial liberalization, if you like. There were even more mandatory standards in China, more than 10,000. So China has been trying to reduce them to below 2,000, while in recent months we see them actually increasing again a bit. But in like partially we really see that more on the voluntary side now than on the mandatory side, but under the umbrella of the state when it comes to national standards. Sector standards work kind of the same way as national standards. The only difference is here that they are developed directly under other state ministries. So, for example, sector standards that relate to ICT or other information technologies are normally developed under MIIT, the China's Ministry of Industry and Industrial Technology. So under MIIT, there's a number of sector standards developed. Then environmental standards are developed in technical committees under the Ministry for environmental issues, etc., etc. So you have a bunch of so-called sector standards developed under different ministries. Almost all of them are voluntary. More than 70,000 exist, but almost all of them are voluntary. Before the reform, we had a huge number of mandatory standards, but they've all become voluntary unless there's a quite lengthy and bureaucratic process to turn a voluntary into a mandatory standard. So the idea here is to still reserve the possibility to have some mandatory sector standards, but at the same time, it is a clear intention from China to have the lowest possible number of mandatory standards in this realm of sector standards. And then finally, we have local standards developed under local governments. So again, a state umbrella under which those are developed. All of them are voluntary. There are no more mandatory local standards that did not used to be the case before the reform. There were also mandatory and voluntary local standards. And we have more than 50,000 of those local standards at the moment. So what we can see in the development of all these three types of standards is, yes, there's private companies, normally industry, more developing the technical specifications that form those standards, but it's really under state guidance. And in many cases, when we look from it from a foreign company's perspective, there's very often really only very limited participation opportunities. Some hurdles are formal, others are informal, but it's really quite difficult sometimes to get involved. So we see a part liberalization, but we still sort of see here a lot of state guidance at play. Clearly see that in the international realm. On the next slide, you can see that in the International Standards Organization, in ISO, China has already increased quite substantially, particularly since 2007, 2008, its engagement. So this is the number of participation in technical committees in ISO, and what you can see here is that the red line is China, which is which has been increasing a lot and is essentially at almost the same level than the UK and Germany at the moment, the two countries that are mostly engaged and most active in ISO. It has surpassed Japan, it has surpassed France, and has also surpassed the United States in its engagement in ISO technical committees here. So you see already an increasing engagement from the Chinese side. On the next slide, you see that also China's share of leadership positions within ISO and IEC have increased. You see that from 2011 to 2018, on the top left corner, the share of leadership positions in secretariats, in technical committees and subcommittees has increased, and even more increased in secretariats of working groups under those TCs and SCs in the same period. You can, of course, also see on the right side that China is still quite behind the more developed and established technical standardization actors like Germany, like the US, like the UK, also France. But we see sort of a process of China catching up, essentially, even though China is far from dominating. Sometimes we read that China is dominating international institutions. That, I think, is not the case. And of course, you could look at other technical standardization organizations like 3GPP, or ICANN, and so on and so forth, and there China's presence is either really even small, or in 3GPP it is substantial, but China is not dominating any of these international institutions either. But if we look at the next slide, I mean, so far you could say China is essentially trying to catch up, but we could also say, well, that's sort of an engagement, it's socializing into the existing system. But interestingly, if we look at the adoption rate ratio, so how much is China actually incorporating international standards into its own system, then we see a declining trend, and a very clear declining trend. We are already at almost only 20% by now in 2017, and the latest figure that I know of is even lower as well. So we see a very continuous trend, downward trend. Now we can of course question and debate, probably across the Atlantic, how important ISO and IEC standards should be, how important the status of international standards should be. The point I want to make here is China is engaging more in those institutions. So it seems to indicate that it regards these institutions as important, but it seems to take them as important when it comes to internationalizing its own ideas about technical standards. But it's very reluctant to actually see those institutions as two-way streets, to actually also adopt what other states are doing. So that, to me, is quite a clear sign that it's more of a power projection. It tries to more internationalize its own standards where it thinks it's in its own interest, and it's very reluctant to then also adopt what other states have actually to propose in these standards. Now, that also complies with a number of findings that we see from China Standards 2035, and what the suggestions are on this front. A key recommendation here is to build what they call a Belt and Road Standards Forum. I trust you are familiar with the Belt and Road Initiative, China's major infrastructure investment initiative. And what is interesting in the context of technical standards here is that China is proposing to erect what is called a Belt and Road Initiative regional standards, so a new type of international standards. And what is also mentioned is that this standards forum, the BRI standards forum, should serve as a platform to coordinate the participants' action in ISO and IEC and the International Telecommunications Union. Again, you could see the second more as trying to assemble more support around Chinese proposals, but stay within the system. But at the same time, you have even these BRI regional standards to be developed that certainly, if these are international standards, are sort of meant to compete with ISO, IEC, and ITU standards. So we have both at the time here, and I think we shouldn't expect that China goes either way. It could combine, I think, both strategies depending on sector, depending on specific issues that are at play. What's the status quo with the Belt and Road Initiative? And I think this is interesting. If you look at the recently released 14th five-year plan, for example, you do find in the section on the Belt and Road Initiative a reference to technical standards as well. And we already see that China has released two so-called action plans. The National Development and Reform Commission has done so, where it formulates specific goals, how it wants to internationalize its domestic standards through the Belt and Road Initiative. Just as a footnote, the National Development Reform Commission is also a legacy of China's planned economy. The institution has less power than it used to have before the reform and opening up policy in China, but the NDRC is sort of still a centrally planning institution in China. You also see that China has under the BRI framework, adopted more than 90 standardization agreements with more than 50 countries by now. But many of them actually are, that the Chinese side acknowledges in private conversations, are paper tigers. What is more substantial so far is that in many Belt and Road projects, technical standards are internationalized. So loans, infrastructure projects are sort of rely on Chinese funding, Chinese loans. Chinese companies are implementing that, implementing these projects based on Chinese technical standards. And by that mechanism, international technical standards from China are then being internationalized to Belt and Road countries. The implications, I think, are pretty straightforward. On the one hand, if you pay attention to international institutions, then of course the BRI is a means to surpass those institutions and simply use China's economic leverage to internationalize those standards as de facto standards in other countries. And if those technical standards, those Chinese standards internationalized, are incompatible with international standards, then it's also a means to lock in those recipient countries to Chinese suppliers, which can be is of course a dynamic that is problematic from an economic viewpoint, but it can also be problematic from a political viewpoint if those technical standards relate to crucial infrastructure, to critical infrastructure, and if, for example, countries in the future along the Belt and Road can only build out their railways relying on state-owned enterprises from China, then of course China has gotten an additional political leverage over these countries.
Well, maybe a great way to end this discussion. And thanks to our attendees for the amazing questions, and to you, Tim, for participating Very informative, a really good deep dive into this relationship of how countries participate in standardization. We will be posting later, but just everyone reach out to Women in Standards if you have follow-up questions. We'll be happy to reach out to Tim and facilitate some answers for you. And thanks to everyone for participating today. Women in Standards supports the extended learning of our members through these events. So again, thanks to our sponsors and Tim and our members for participating today. Thank you so much and have a great day.